So I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we reside today, mostly Nangal and Ngambri people, and pay respect to their elders past, present, and emerging.
So Dave came to ANU in 1971 to study physics, and he ended up with a double major in psychology and honours in computer science. He tutored computer science for nearly 5 years. By the way, that's how I started. I came not as a PhD student, but as a humble tutor. And he managed ANU's first undergrad computing facility, then became a campus evangelist for text processing, laser printing, networking, and microcomputing. Dave supported 2 ANU supercomputers, wrote a text retrieval system in his spare time, was seconded to the Access CRC, gained a PhD by published work, joined the CSIRO as a research scientist, satisfied external earnings targets by licensing enterprise search software, grew revenue to the level of embarrassment, spent 5 years at the Funnelback spin-off, then 4 working in the Bing web search engine. And I think that's a remarkable note with respect to computer science in Canberra, in that Dave, a number of his alumni went and worked in both Microsoft and Google and made big impacts in search. And at a point in time came when Dave was able to get some of those people to come back to Canberra, and Dave worked there in Canberra with an offspring of the Bing search engine. And that's a great reflection on the impact Dave had, both academically through the students who he supervised, and then industrially actually bringing leading people internationally into Canberra, into an office on London Circuit. And I think that's a great thing to note. Dave retired in 2018 and has since written The History of ANU Computing and Funnelback and Me. Since leaving ANU employment in 1998, he's been an honorary at the school, and he's supervised 10 PhDs, and he still writes code. Dave, without further ado, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, well, I'm not as familiar with Zoom as you people are, so just bear with me while I share a screen. Thanks for the kind words, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to reflect on my career journey. I feel quite honoured. I'm very happy to have been associated with ANU Computer Science for all but 1 year of its 50-year history. Nostalgia does get better with age. First, I'm going to tell the story of my career. Then I'm going to discuss issues arising and lessons learned, in the hope that it may help you think about your career, or at least provide some amusement. I expect my talk will take about 45 minutes, and I'm happy to stick around for as long as you want after that for questions and discussion. So I grew up in Beechworth, which is an old gold mining town. My first paid employment was as a guide in the historic building where miners stored gunpowder. That's much safer than storing it in your tent. In my final year at Beechworth High School, I had teachers for English, chemistry, and pure maths. I did physics, applied maths, and French by correspondence. It was quite a small school. My first encounter with programming was courtesy of Monash University. You pushed out chads in these cards with a paperclip. Unlike the 2000 presidential election in Florida, there were no issues with hanging chads. My school posted the card deck to Monash, and printout was returned 2 weeks later. That's a turnaround for you. It's more than 50 years since I left school. As you can see, the length of time in each phase of my employment has been monotonically decreasing. I hope I can reverse that trend for my retirement. As you can see, mine is far from a typical academic career. My staff candidature for a PhD on computer animation suffered from network and equipment limitations and struggled to compete with my other interests. But in 1991, I started researching in my spare time and was seconded as a researcher to the Access Cooperative Research Centre. In 1998, I supplicated for a PhD by published work and joined CSIRO. If you think supplicating sounds bad, remember that you probably had to submit. In my first quarter century in CS, there was no culture of research commercialisation. There was a view that publicly funded research belonged to the community and you shouldn't make money from it. By the 1990s, the Access CRC and CSIRO had commercialisation goals. Panoptic, shown there in the green and the timeline, was a cottage industry within CSIRO, which eventually spun off as Funnelback in 2005. Now that you've got an overview of the timelines, let me share a bit more detail. As a student, I came to ANU to study physics, but switched after first year. My experience in the Beechworth Mental Hospital attracted me to study psychology rather than applied maths 1. Pure maths 1 was a prerequisite for the introductory computer science unit, BO1. Many computer science lectures were held in the Copeland Lecture Theatre, as shown here, on a Bush day or something. Computer science BO1 assignments involved card decks and ANSI Fortran. In 1972, 3 IBM 029 card punches, like the one at the bottom left, were provided for 260 BO1 students, and however many students were enrolled in computer science 2. Ray Jarvis, the top right, was head of department for 9 years. He drove an E-type Jaguar and smoked a pipe. Vicky Peterson was my tutor in BO1, dealing with tutorial groups of 65 students. The Vietnam War was in full swing in 1971, and males turning 20 were required to register for military national service, but they weren't allowed to vote until they were 21. Conscripts could be sent to fight in Vietnam. A birthday ballot was held to choose the lucky winners. Top left shows 2 people I used to know burning a national service notice. The election of Gough Whitlam as Prime Minister in 1972 narrowly avoided the need for me to decide whether I would refuse to register. In 1972, ANU required its first interactive time-sharing computer, the Univac 1108, whose console is shown at the bottom right. It was housed in the elephant stables in the basement of the Menzies Library. Univac memory cost around $1 a byte. On that basis, my Macintosh is worth $64 billion. My first IT employment was in the Department of Seismology in the Research School of Earth Sciences. When Professor Anton Hales from Texas was appointed RSES director in 1973, he insisted on the purchase of a Datacraft computer. It was serial number 5, and the nearest support for it was in Fort Lauderdale in Florida. Hales reasoned that 24-bit integers and 48-bit double precision were adequate for his programs and saved money on unnecessary hardware. Ken Muirhead did the hardware support, and I was the software. I wrote a library for the Versatech printer plotter. Amazingly, Ken diagnosed and fixed a fault with the B and K, that's branch on negative K register instruction, by soldering in a new transistor. I was a tutor in computer science for 4.5 years for courses run by Robin Stanton, Peter Creasy, and John Hurst. John's introductory BO1 course taught structured programming in Algol W, later Pascal. Robin Stanton's course focused on programming concepts like recursion, object classes, and coroutines, and the runtime structures to support them. Peter Creasy taught operating systems, and some of his courses required students to write programs in Nova Assembler. But the few programs which actually assembled usually crashed the Nova because it had no memory protection registers. I wrote a Nova simulator in Nova Assembler, and it ran on the Nova, which was used by students for years, and it never crashed. As a tutor, I enjoyed explaining things to students, though some really struggled to understand recursion. I was also frustrated by student use of the rubbish bin algorithm. Ask me about it later if you're curious, or read my book. Initially, I enjoyed the variety of solutions that students came up with in their assignments, but after 4 years, I felt I'd seen them all. Time for a change. In 1979, ANU moved a traded-in Deck 10 to Copeland to provide the first computing facilities specifically for undergraduates. I became the site manager. One of those big blue cabinets, as tall as me, held 16K words of core memory. That's about 80 kilobytes. Jeff Houston, who later brought the internet to Australia, even installing ARNet routers at every university, took my job as tutor and then joined me in running the Deck 10. We worked on all manner of software optimizations to squeeze more and more students from statistics, accounting, prehistory and computer science onto quite pathetic hardware. We wrote in a mixture of Simula 67 and Deck 10 assembler. The second Deck 10, replacing the old one, supported 90 or more simultaneous time-sharing users on a configuration with less than 4 megabytes of RAM. Mind you, Ray Jarvis used to joke that time-sharing provided a convincing illusion that other users had the machine to themselves. When the Deck KL10 was prematurely replaced by a pair of Deck Vaxes, I correctly feared that response time would be poor. I managed the changeover and learnt C, then transferred to the Computer Services Centre in 1984. My role at the Computer Services Centre was that of evangelist for text processing, laser printing, microcomputers and networks. CSIRO had a Xerox laser printer shown on the right, capable of 2 pages per second, which seemed astonishing at the time. ANU's report on the future of university computing failed to predict the flood of Apple Macintoshes, which arrived on campus from 1984. I was a member of the Apple University Consortium user group and wrote text processing software in M68000 assembler for the Mac. In 1988, I returned to DCS as head programmer and implemented a Stanton-driven proliferation of Sun workstations. A friend of mine thought it was funny that my wife was a neuropsychologist and I was a head programmer. As shown on the right, the cabling was initially thick wire Ethernet, and transceivers like the one shown cost more than $1,000. These vampire tap ones were much better than the first generation because you didn't have to cut the cable to connect them. In the early 1990s, so-called 3M workstations like these Suns, 3M meaning 1 MIPS, 1 megabyte and 1 megapixel, were considered ideal machines for computer science. How things have changed. In 1991, ANU had 3 supercomputers, which were each faster than any located in countries not starting with U or J. I received hardware training on both the connection machine CM2 on the right, whose nodes formed a 12-dimensional hypercube, and the Fujitsu AP1000, whose nodes formed a 2D torus. I was trained on hardware, but fortunately I never had to fix anything. I was the site manager of the AP1000, which was located in the computer science department. And I was also a participant in the ANU Fujitsu CAP project. CAP stands for Cellular Array Processor, which surely must be a Japanese tongue twister. DCS had a uniquely close relationship with the CAP hardware and software team in Fujitsu laboratories. Peter Bailey recalled that in 1991, I ran a 4th-year honours course on parallel programming, but I'd completely forgotten about it. In 1991, I started writing a parallel text retrieval system for the AP1000, which was called Padre, the Parallel Document Retrieval Engine. I did it because I wanted to learn how to write parallel programs. I worked with 550 megabytes of SGML, the markup source of the 20-volume Oxford English Dictionary. and I collaborated with the Australian National Dictionary Centre, and particularly Harriet Michel. I received an acknowledgement in that edition of the Australian Concise Oxford Dictionary and published my first paper at the Australasian Supercomputing Conference in 1991. In 1993, the CAP project was folded into the Access Cooperative Research Centre, and I became seconded there part-time as a researcher. Initially, I was a member of Paul Thistlethwaite's pastime team, shown here. Paul is second from the left. In 1994, Paul and I began participating in the annual text retrieval conference known as TREC and organised by NIST in Washington, DC. TREC is not a competition, but in 1997 we won, at least in one small segment. One night, Paul and I were developing TREC-winning algorithms in the CS&IT building at 3 a.m, sitting in the tea room eating Tim Tams and drinking coffee, when who should walk in but PhD student Steve Blackburn. By 1998, I'd written enough papers on information retrieval to supplicate for a PhD by published work. After my earlier abandonment of a staff candidature, this approach had many advantages. No commitment, no enrolment, no supervisor, no deadline, no fees. You may think that there was no pressure, but when I got the thing bound, I paid a considerable additional sum of money for expedited turnaround and couldn't wait to dump the copies on the relevant desk in the graduate student section. I've subsequently worked a great deal with Nick Craswell on the right, being his supervisor, his boss, and later reported to him. Just as I supplicated, I was given the opportunity to join CSIRO as a research scientist in the area of information retrieval, while remaining partly seconded to Access. I thought that CSIRO was the ideal organisation for me. Try to do world-class research and apply it for benefit to Australia and the world. Hopefully like David Henshaw, whose story is mentioned on the slide. Over my 10 years at CSIRO, it gradually dawned on me that CSIRO's very top-down management didn't really want me to decide what world-class research I should do. By the end of my time at CSIRO, a central committee decided each year which projects would be funded and who would work on them. CSIRO had a massive external earnings target that really amounted to the fact that research scientists were supposed to earn their own salary. In IT, very few people wanted to commission CSIRO to conduct research, so I decided to generate a revenue stream by licensing our text retrieval software. In 1998, Paul Thistlethwaite came up with an Access plan, modestly called Awesome, to build a tool for management and search of organisational intranets. This was the plan I spent the next 15 years executing. Unfortunately, Paul died of cancer in early 1999. I took over supervision of Nick Craswell's PhD, and Nick, Peter Bailey and I took over Paul's fourth-year document technologies course. The three of us also implemented the first instalment of Paul's awesome vision. The first adopter of our intranet search engine was ANU, and the system launched as Sanity in July 1999. We pretty soon changed the name to Panoptic to avoid potential trademark issues. Here's Dean Terrell, ANU Vice Chancellor, and Darryl Williamson, Access CEO, at the official launch. A continuing focus of our research was how to measure the quality of search engine results. If you can't measure the quality of results they return, you can't improve. With statistical advice from my wife, Kathy Griffiths, we conducted evaluations of public web search engines on different types of search. And you can see 3 different graphs on the slide. At the search engines meeting in Boston in 2000, I presented our results and got into an intense argument with Larry Page, who was one of the Google founders. He said, You just know when stuff works. However, of course, within Google, there is a strong focus on measuring and improving search performance. He also said that while many web publishers try to keep visitors on their site for as long as possible, Google wanted them gone within 7 seconds. In April 2003, I was told by a CSIRO manager that I'd created a massive liability for CSIRO through my software licensing, that I was featherbedding on my colleagues, and that the Panoptic business model would never succeed. Between then and June the 30th that year, customers flooded in. Our external earnings target was smashed. I was awarded an honorary doctorate from a university in Switzerland, and we'd won an Editor's Choice Award from a US tech magazine. Zero to hero, and later back again. By 2005, Panoptic was successful to the point of embarrassment. CSIRO shouldn't be competing with the private sector. We'd quadrupled our annual earnings target, earning more than $1 million. The team had grown, and so had our customer base. Because of all the customer installations, we needed to constantly upgrade our software engineering standards. During all this commercial activity, I continued to publish and to supervise PhDs. Overall, I supervised 10, 9 at the ANU. Dr. Tim Tang, Dr. Tom Rowlands, and Dr. Paul Thomas feature in these photos. I also conducted oral examinations of PhD students in Scotland, Netherlands, France, and Switzerland. The latter two were conducted in French. The one at the University of Twente was the most fun. At CSIRO, I was very proud of the virtuous cycle I'd created: to do some research, embody it in a product, license it to customers, learn about interesting problems from the customers and prospects, do more research, embody it in the product, get more customers, and so on and so forth. The spin-off of the technology as Funnelback Proprietary Limited should have ruined that. CSIRO wanted the science and innovation to remain with CSIRO, while the company sold and supported the product. I was conflicted. I wanted to remain a scientist, but I also wanted to be involved with the company and to see it succeed. I also wanted to maintain access to customers and their problems, users, and data. In the end, Stuart Beale, Brett Matson, and Francis Crimmins left to found the company, but I stayed in CSIRO. However, I arranged to be 50% seconded to the company. Within CSIRO, I stepped down as team leader, focused on research, and my team member, Peter Bailey, became my boss. I was happy to lead and manage teams working on a project I was actively technically involved in, but I really didn't want to be a manager of projects that I wasn't deeply invested in. After 10 years in CSIRO, the top-down planning, and in my view, excessive bureaucracy, became too much. I determined to leave. I applied for a fully funded ARC professorial fellowship, and I was rated in the top 5%, but 0 were awarded that year. I successfully interviewed at Microsoft Bing, but they wanted me to move to Melbourne, and Kathy and I wanted to stay in Canberra. I ended up taking the role of chief scientist at Funnelback in July 2008. In addition to research and coding, I was quite involved in sales and business development, much of it in the UK. Top left is Westminster Abbey, where I preached the value of effective enterprise search. Top middle is Australia House in London, where I also represented. Top right is the Australian Stock Exchange, where we created a funnelback search of their website and gave them a side-by-side comparison with their incumbent search technology. When they found that ours was superior in about 98% of queries, they were very keen to sign up. I made major product enhancements, coding on planes and trains, to support the special needs of the Russian part of TUI travel, but we weren't successful. It was the same story at Tesco, where our project was cruelled by a large incumbent vendor. We weren't successful at Lloyd's Bank or the Royal Courts of Justice either, but it was quite an experience to visit them and try our best. As I hope you can see from this aircraft display, I travelled some incredible distances. Can you see the figure? 185,198 kilometres, time since departure 1 hour and 2 minutes. Being serious, I counted up that I've passed through London Heathrow Airport 110 times. Despite carbon offsetting, that makes me feel quite guilty. Funnelback was bought from CSIRO by Squiz Proprietary Limited in 2009, and for 3 years or so ran largely independently. Later, as time went on, Funnelback became more and more integrated into Squiz. The startup feel was lost, and we moved more and more towards Squiz's business model, which was heavily focused on consulting revenue, billable hours. My vision had been to try and make a really good product and cloud service, which required minimal consulting, allowing large scale up and big revenue from licenses and hosting fees. Unfortunately, that vision was losing traction. At this stage, Nick Craswell and Peter Bailey were working for Microsoft on the Bing search engine. Peter wanted to continue to work for them, but to return to Canberra. Microsoft said that it would work better if there was more than one scientist in Canberra, and they asked me if I wanted to join Peter. So I interviewed in Seattle again in 2013 and joined Nick Craswell's science team. In my first Bing meeting with Peter Bailey at Tilly's in Lynham, Peter described a problem with the Bing query suggestion system. It worked by prefix matching. Could I build a system based on inverted files which could index 1 billion importance-weighted short texts and return a set of ranked matches with no more than 10 millisecond latency and at a rate of 1 to 10 billion queries a day? The result was QBasher, which has now been open sourced. I thought I should do the Microsoft thing and code it in C# or C++, although I hate C++. My boss, Jan Pedersen, said, "You know C, don't you? Code in that. It's a subset of C++. There's nothing like having your code run for weeks, processing hundreds of millions of requests a day per server to reassure you that there are no serious memory leaks or pointer exceptions, despite the use of a dangerous programming language." It turned out that QBasher could be used to classify short texts as well. It could be used, and was actually used, for recognizing song lyrics lines, famous quotations, etc., prior to searching the main web indexes. We thought about publishing some of the indexing techniques we came up with, but reproducibility was important, and we couldn't distribute the data we were working with. So I started exploring methods of synthesizing text collections to enable reproducibility, and ended up writing a monograph on that. The test collection synthesis code is also open source. By the time I left, Microsoft had developed a totally different attitude to open source. They embraced it with open arms, both contributing and making use of. Oh, and Bing became profitable after I joined. In 2018, I decided to retire. Retirement has some wonderfully positive attributes, but there's quite a lot of adaptation required. I find I need a daily mix of purposeful activity and exercise in order to be able to get the most out of doing nothing. A long career in research and commercialisation has accustomed me to an endless staccato stream of messages conveying rewards and punishments, papers accepted, papers rejected, invitations, awards, opportunities, contracts signed, serious code malfunctions, service downtime, threats, customer refusals, and more. In retirement, I can't rid myself of the habit of nervously checking my phone every half hour, even though not much happens these days. After a year of retirement, I started collection synthesis coding again. I bought a MacBook Pro with 64 gigabytes of RAM to run experiments for the research monograph. What a pity it wasn't one with the M1 Max chip. 400 gigabytes per second memory bandwidth. That's amazing. I found I liked writing, and I revved up a book I wrote and almost finished about European travels we made in 1979. Then, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of ANU Computer Science, I wrote a history of ANU computing. And finally, I've just finished a book about the story of Funnelback and the research that led up to it. Okay, that's a brief description of what I've done in the last 50 years. What did I learn? Over 50 years, I've filled my brain, my limited brain, with stuff that seemed critical at the time, but quickly became valueless. Cool party trick. If you deposit 30 and 30 on a deck 10, you make it reboot. Fun fact, the JUMP instruction on a deck 10 means never jump. The JRST, jump and reset instruction, is 15% faster, and it does actually jump. My first ever paper was typed by a typist on Gestetner stencils. My second was in Interleaf. The remaining 100 plus and all my books are in LaTeX. I'm confident that if I need to update any of them, apart from the first two, in the next 20 years, I will be able to do so, no matter what hardware or operating system I might be using. After 20 years, I won't care. In the last few years, all my code has been in C, Perl, or PostScript, although I have just started to learn Swift. Fundamental ideas never lose their value. Algorithmic complexity, for example, sorting algorithms, hashing functions. Even quite recently, when working on user interactions, I've been able to make use of papers I read in psychology 40 years before. For example, work by George Miller and by Stevens. Over the years, I became really proficient at debugging because I was similarly proficient at putting bugs in my code. I've long wished that I'd done more maths and that I'd been better at it. I've always liked building things and understanding how things work. Computer rooms, trains, solar panels, batteries, bridges, etc. Before COVID, I started attending ANU seminars on a broader range of topics, on solar panels, on renewable energy, on economics, and on garbage collection. It's much more fun attending and presenting seminars in person, so you can chat informally with the audience and the presenter. I do regret that COVID-19 has dried up this source of entertainment for me and prevented this from being an in-person event. It would have been nice to chat with you all afterwards over a coffee and a biscuit. In the course of my career, many issues have arisen, many moral questions. I bet they have arisen or will arise for you too. Here's some accumulated thoughts for you to accept or reject as you wish. At Axis, Cyro and Funnelback, I often worked 70-hour weeks. In Cyro, large amounts of time were taken up in planning, review, annual project proposals, performance appraisals, internal processes, and of course, time spent on securing external earnings. Without working much more than 38 hours, I could have done very little actual science. Maintain your aim was the training mantra in the Australian Army. It also applies to how you allocate your effort to different endeavours. If you flip from project to project and keep choosing new goals, you may never achieve any of them. Former CSIRO CEO, Jeff Garrett, described me as the monomaniac behind Funnelback. WWW stood for weekends without work, and I made sure I had at least a couple every year. One of my colleagues at Funnelback took a phone call after 5 p.m. and transferred it to me and wrote the note on the left. $500,000 was enough to keep half a dozen people employed for a year. To my relief, the decision immediately after the phone call went in our favour. Stress was quite prevalent in my work life. I'm quite a nervous person, but I stood up and gave hundreds of presentations, some in challenging circumstances. There are all sorts of workplace stresses that I'm sure you know. One for me was, you must all be in your offices between 9 and 12 on Thursday in case the boss needs to phone you to tell you that you're sacked. A modicum of stress improves performance, but an excess can cause serious health problems. Stress can't be avoided, but it needs to be managed. This photo of Venice looks very relaxed, but it was taken while I was attending a conference in Mestre, during which I was being attacked by a barrage of email from senior people accusing me of sins which were, in my view, their own. It causes stress, but I think a leader has to stand up for team members, and we should all stand up for what's right. Great achievements are rarely made by a single individual. You really need a strong team in which everyone is performing and heading in the same direction. I have no generic formula to offer on dealing with difficult people. It is the case that some team members can be motivated by other than your exciting vision. They want your job, they don't like you. They think the team should follow their vision rather than yours, or they're just disruptive. Removing non-performers is essential in a small company, though painful, because if revenue doesn't exceed outgoings, the company will fail and even the strong performers will lose their jobs. Fortunately, it wasn't my role to do this. Larry Page and Sergey Brin created Backrub, later known as Google, while PhD students at Stanford. They received donations of hardware from major vendors. They had invaluable commercialisation mentorship with large-scale early investment. Despite all the investment, they ended up with large percentages of Google stock. As far as I know, they still have them. In contrast, the Funnelback spin-off was owned and controlled by CSIRO. The founders were not on the board. They received a small percentage of shares as options, which could only be exercised when CSIRO exited. On the positive side, I guess, they didn't have to mortgage their houses. There was no external capital injection and growth was slow. Dividends from Funnelback paid off Squiz's debt to CSIRO rather than being invested in R&D or in sales and marketing. Australia's taxation of options was unfortunate. When I joined Funnelback, after the value had been vended into the company, the strike price of my options had to be ridiculously high so that I wasn't hit immediately with a massive tax bill for options I couldn't exercise and which may never have been worth anything. I was delighted to read yesterday that new Commonwealth legislation is moving to improve this. Over the years, I had many arguments with colleagues about the importance of code efficiency. When a program is a one-off or runs infrequently for a short time, it's clearly the case that human efficiency is paramount. On the other hand, when a program runs continuously and uses a large number of servers, savings on machines can greatly outweigh programmer costs. I once received an email from another group which said, due to algorithmic improvements, we are able to release 11,000 servers for other users within the company. Think about it. That's a saving of about $30 million and 20,000 tonnes of CO2 per year. Left is the physical reality of the cloud, and right is the physical reality of what powers it in Australia. That's Loy Yang in Victoria, running on brown coal. I had the opportunity to join Google's search team in 2000. repeated in each of the following 4 years, but I didn't want to move to California. My former PhD student, Tristan Upstill, did. He later ran the Google search quality team for a while and is now VP of Engineering in charge of Android R&D. I could have joined Bing 5 years earlier and earned a lot more money, but it would have had to work from Melbourne. As you gathered, Kathy and I like living in Canberra. I had quite a few opportunities over the years to take on non-technical management roles, and I turned them all down. Yes, I still write code. Team cohesion, collaborations, and developing relationships with customers and partners requires building relationships. Both coffee and alcohol can be useful. The former is more productivity enhancing than the latter. While I was working, coffee had no effect on my wakefulness, but now that I drink less of it, I find that coffee after lunch may harm my ability to get to sleep. Most of my meetings at Microsoft were teleconferences. Interestingly, one-on-one meetings were always audio only. They were fine, but I found that they worked better with people you already knew. You'd know better than I would, but I feel that building new relationships by teleconference without caffeine, alcohol, or Tim Tams is less effective. I sympathise with all of you who've had to teach remotely for so long. A double shot macchiato, please, if you're buying, and I don't mind a Belgian golden ale once in a while. Another promoter of productivity and the development of relationships has been having and sharing fun. Many of the relationship building activities listed on this slide would be more difficult to achieve through teleconference. Of course, there is the unfortunate issue of CO2 emissions. In my career, there have, of course, been periods of unpleasantness and pain. My experience of breast cancer in 2007 caused a major re-evaluation of my priorities. My conclusion was that life was too short to spend doing things you hate. I doubled down on wanting to do research and coding and to minimize time spent in pointless meetings, excessive planning, and endless project and performance reviewing. Overall, I've been able to spend a lot of my working life doing what I wanted to do with enthusiasm and passion. I'm very grateful to people like Robin Stanton, Brian Molinari, and Chris Johnson from DCS, Darryl Williamson and John O'Callaghan of Axis, Ross Wilkinson and Alex Zelinsky of Cyro, and Stuart Beale and Brett Matson of Funnelback for facilitating and encouraging my work journey. Here are a few final words of wisdom. In my most recent book, I've devoted a chapter to questions like, why didn't Funnelback become as successful as Google? Why hasn't it yet made billions? There are lots of answers in the book, which I won't go into here, but the chapter concludes on a high note. Funnelback has created a lot of good jobs. It has created a lot of revenue. It has significantly improved the ability of many organisations to find information. And it was able to successfully compete with Google in the enterprise search space. In my computer science career, I've been privileged to interact with some of the superstars. I had breakfast with Bill Gates, morning tea with Edsger Dijkstra, lunch with Tim Berners-Lee, afternoon tea with Linus Torvalds, and a public argument with Larry Page. Proposals for dinner are welcome and will be judged on merit. Cycling is something that many people can do and enjoy even in retirement. This is me nearing the finish of the 50-kilometre version of the 2019 Fitz's Challenge with someone half my age. We spurred each other on. It's not a race, it's not a competition. Unfortunately, she beat me by a couple of seconds. You can find links to all my books on my personal website, which is listed at the bottom here. Thank you for listening to my story. I'm happy to try and answer any questions you may have and to listen to any wrong-headed criticisms you want to put forward. I'm a little deaf, particularly to criticism, so please speak as clearly as you can. Thank you.
So Dave, you have switched between many projects and many careers. What are your, I guess, philosophy for stop doing something?
I think when what you're doing becomes routine and you're no longer getting the excitement or the strong rewards that you once got. And I guess it depends whether there's an opening opportunity. In the 23 years, I think it was, that I worked at ANU, every time I felt, I was running out of steam with the role I had, some new opportunity opened up and I moved to it.
Dave, this is Chris Johnson. I want to thank you for completing that book of history of the ANU computing, which was sort of dragging along and not getting anywhere until you put your firm focus on it and maintained the aim. So I think you've done a great job there. Turned out a lovely book, despite it being in LaTeX. But but I'm sure, as you say, it'll survive into the second, third, and fourth editions over the next 20 years.
Thank you.
Here. Can I just quickly follow up on that from my car while I'm about to pick up my children from school? But Dave, thank you for that talk. That was wonderful. I'd like to ask your permission for us to put the PDF for your book into low Earth orbit. And I'm quite serious. There's a request come in for some collateral to be put onto a satellite in low Earth orbit from the ANU, representing 75 years of activity at the ANU. And I was thinking your book actually might be a useful thing to put into that repository in low Earth orbit. And I thought you might be amused to be able to do that. So do we have your permission?
Definitely you do. As Steve mentioned it to me before, and I said I'd be delighted to have an intergalactic audience.
Oh, so I'm gonna send in a suggestion that we do that. Thank you.
Good. It was a surprise to me that the book ended up weighing more than 1 kilo. Using 105 GSM paper with gloss and whatever else. It's really quite a weighty tome. I apologise to anyone who's seen it.
I think we'll just be putting the PDF on a storage medium up there.
Oh.
Cheers.
Font size can make a difference.
I think Carrie Taylor's hand is up. So, Carrie.
Hi, David. I'm going to ask you something that may be a bit challenging. You said you don't like to accept criticisms, or was it, or that you will? But I know you're one of the things I have admired about you over the years, and you did it again in this talk, is your ability to dish out very honest and bold, highly acerbic commentary on the organisations and operations around you. So what I wondered is, I'm very curious about this, if you have any stories or if you're aware of any negative, any pushback, any impact from your bold comments that have come back to you in a way that you found either damaging or difficult, or whether you just got away with it all these years.
I think that basically I got away with it all these years. You may be interested that in both of the books, there are a considerable number of really good stories that didn't make it into the final version because they might have upset people, or they didn't reflect people in a good light. But part of my reason for being outspoken, and I guess you're mostly thinking of the CSIRO days, was because I really felt that the place needed to change. That really, I remember being asked in a meeting, the CSIRO ICT Centre is going to be subjected to a science review in a year or two's time or something other. How can we improve our science output? And my answer, which and Alex thought was a joke, was that we should spend more time doing science. And, you know, I really honestly felt that CSIRO could improve its processes by doing less reviewing, less endless planning and so on. You know, annual performance assessments were done, you know, every 3 months. Projects were reviewed every month with, you know, red, green, amber, puce, pink, purple, and aquamarine traffic lights. And I really hoped that I could change the way the organisation worked. So it was, you know, largely, it was partly out of frustration with things that, you know, increased, you know, dramatically in the last couple of years. But it was also an honest desire to, you know, try and change the way things worked. I don't think I succeeded. But...
Yeah, thank you for that. But I didn't hear about any negative consequences for you, so perhaps that's a very positive story, Dave.
I'm not aware of any.
It's not like your colleagues would have argued with you about those truths.
I see Tristan
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I see Tristan Upstill from Hawaii tuned in.
So Brandon is next, then Sylvie and
Okay.
others.
Hi, Dave. Thanks for the great talk. I was wondering, you observed the development of the computer science department at ANU over an extremely long period, basically for the entire length of its existence. But you didn't offer us terribly much in terms of advice on the development of such a department. Would you like to take the opportunity to do so now?
The future development of the department?
The development, management. You can insult a few people, it's okay.
Well, that's an interesting question.
Note that you have several former heads of department present waiting on your words.
Yes, I've noticed a couple of, from Newcastle, I see one of them. Well, my close involvement with the computer science department was, you know, initially as a student, and then in an era where, you know, there was no culture of commercialization, or, you know, in fact, the idea that people could make money out of publicly funded research, you know, was considered shameful, or, you know, was cheating in some way. In fact, one of my information retrieval colleagues at the University of Massachusetts got absolutely lambasted in a newspaper because he formed a private company, etc. So things have obviously changed. And although I've been an honorary in the department and supervised students and had a minimal connection, I haven't really thought about, you know, what should be taught, how much focus there should be on commercializing and forming spin-offs and so on. I noticed that the government has just today announced, you know, these big $40 or $60 million grants to universities, where the people who are involved in the project have to submit to a regime where their promotions are not determined by publications, but by research outputs, by commercialization results. And I don't think I'm confident enough to know whether that's the way the department should be heading, or, you know, how much it should transition from the old teaching and academic research direction. Perhaps I should take the question on notice.
I guess it's my turn then. One of the aspects of your story was that you stayed in Canberra. You even were ready to decline, you know, jobs that may have been attractive unless you could stay here. Even if this forced you to go, I don't know, 110 times via London Airport. Is this something you, I don't know, in retrospect, you might, I don't know, do differently? I mean, do you regret not to have, I don't know, spend more time maybe overseas or other places, or no, actually you're really happy about this? It hasn't, I don't know, impacted negatively what you could have done.
It's interesting. The idea of, I quite like the idea of going in and working in a French-speaking environment, in Switzerland or France or somewhere. And I did have a visiting professorship at a university in Toulouse, which I really enjoyed. But on the whole, I'm quite happy. I've been to absolutely marvelous places, and I've interacted with inspiring teams overseas. But I was always happy to be located in Canberra. And one of the factors was, the two-body problem, as they say. My wife was doing what I considered to be, much more valuable, impactful work in the mental health area than, fiddling around with computer code and making people's searches more effective. So, that was another significant factor. But, maybe, there are various regrets. Perhaps I regret, some of my personal characteristics. I'd like to have been a better mathematician, for example, and you can't do anything about that. I do sometimes wonder whether, when CSIRO sold Funnelback to Squiz, the eventual outcome of that, perhaps wasn't as great as, or didn't go down the path that I would have preferred. And there was some discussion at the time about whether there should be a management buyout, whether the people who were involved in the spin-off should have bought the company from CSIRO. And as it turned out, Squiz, got vendor finance. They paid for the company over 4 years, I think it was. And, maybe, if we'd been able to do that and pay the purchase price using the dividends from the company, it wouldn't have been such a risk. Mm-hmm. But none of us was prepared to, take out huge mortgages on our houses or whatever to buy the company. And also the Squiz connection, because Squiz had a branch in Poland and another one in the UK, and looked to have potential to, do business in the US. And if we'd done the management buyout thing, we couldn't have just gone over and piggybacked off an already established sales organisation in London. So counterfactuals are always very difficult. You can predict one move ahead, but after that, who knows?
In fact, I mean, if I may, one more thing. So your attitude with respect to risk, are you happy retrospectively of what it was, or do you think, oh man, I should have taken more risk, or the opposite, thinking, oh man, I did this is crazy, good that it worked, yeah. Would you?
I think I'm a quite a cautious person. I haven't taken risky decisions. We haven't borrowed huge amounts of money for real estate or anything like that, and we've ended up in a good situation in retirement. So really no regrets there. I don't think I would have. With the one thing about a question about the management buyout, mm-hmm. I think maybe I'm happy enough with the risk.
Hello, David. I have a question. Not a question, a comment. I'm new to ANU, and I found the talk absolutely inspiring, and it was awesome. And I really want to learn more about ANU. So thank you for telling your story.
You're very welcome.
Here's one, just to finish up for the technical. You mentioned programming in Simula 67. wasn't that so much better than C++ or anything else like that, if we'd managed to maintain it as a living language?
You realise that the pleasure of coding in a language is very much dependent on the implementation of the compiler and the availability of libraries. And so Dec 10 Simula was just marvelous. You know, you could embed Dec 10 assembler in the Simula 67. There was a significant library of system programming stuff in Simula 67. It was a pleasure to use. When ANU changed, replaced the Dec 10 with VAXes, the VAX, the Dec 10, the Simula 67 compiler on the VAXes was an S port. It was, you know, there was an intermediate language, and the programs compiled in Simula ran 10 times slower than the Dec 10, and it took 100 times as long to compile. And there were no system programming libraries and so on, so it was just a dead end as far as using it for practical purposes. But Simula 67, you know, had classes and coroutines and inheritance and all manner of wonderful things. And I do remember, you know, 10 years after or 20 years after I stopped using Simula 67, someone came and gave a talk in the department on C++. And, but, you know, this is sort of like an ugly and messy implementation of a subset of things that are already in Simula 67. And so I took an instant dislike to C++ and managed to maintain that through my career.
Well, when you say you're still coding, so am I occasionally. And the last stuff I've been writing is in Python, just because it's the handiest implementation I've got at the moment. And it's adequate.
Yes, and Python certainly seems to be the way forward for, you know, the machine learning stuff. You know, there's so many, I don't even know what the words are for them, you know, packages or environments in Python where, you know, you don't have to code any of the guts of stuff. It's just tying it all together.
And Dave, we heard from someone who's new to the department saying thank you for that great sharing all that. And as someone who's been here for 30 years, I'll echo that from a different perspective and say how much I really appreciated what you had to say. It's every time you speak, there's always something I hadn't heard before. And I'm sure many of my colleagues who've been around computer science longer than I would share that view. Thank you.
Here, Dave.
Let's give Dave a round of applause. Thanks everyone for coming.